All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. Surprise, I'm not Ethan. He had something unexpected that he had to attend to. So I am so excited to fill in and be here today. Before I go over some of the expectations of the community conversations, just going to introduce myself. I'm Callie Werner. I am the Director of Referral Relations at OCD Institute of Texas and a behavioral therapist there. I've done a lot on and off with IOCDF, so hopefully I'll be able to see some familiar faces in the chat. But yeah, just really excited to jump in and answer your questions. For those that do know who I am, I'm a pretty open book about clinical and personal experiences. So really looking forward to diving in with you guys today. Just a few announcements as we get started, just to keep in mind, this live stream is educational and is not intended to replace therapy. For treatment-related questions, please work with your provider or contact any local clinician that is on the IOCDF online resource directory at iocdf.org/find-help to locate a trained clinician near you. The International OCD Foundation is not a crisis hotline. If you are in crisis or you're feeling suicidal or unsafe, please call 988, the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, by dialing 988. You can also access online at www.988lifeline.org or go to your local emergency room or call 911. We want to create a safe space and be kind and respectful for everyone. So at the end of the day, we're all here to support one another. A note that this is being recorded and a note that this is being broadcast on several social media platforms and is being recorded. So just to keep all of that in mind. But with that being said, I'm really looking forward to seeing all of your comments. And so, yes, please feel free to put those in the chat. Hi, Spence. Hi, Amy. Hi, Maya. And hi, Amy again. So good to see all of you popping on now. I think I wanted to start off with something that's really just a few things that have really resonated with me. And please start just dropping your comments in the chat as I chat away. But, oh, Spence, you're also in Houston. Very cool. Yeah, in Houston, Texas. The first one, though, is this analogy that I've really liked for OCD lately and rumination, and I've been using it with a lot of my patients, is this idea that if I were to put an equation up on the board right now, and I asked you all not to sign or not to figure out the equation, like let's say you're not this incredible mathematician guru, maybe you are, and I just said, let the equation be there, notice it, and don't solve it. Well, I think what you would find is that you're able to do that, right? You're able to, unless it's like 4 + 4, sometimes our brains automatically go 8. But if it's a more complex equation where you would maybe need a calculator or maybe need to write out some numbers, you could tell yourself, yeah, I don't need to solve that right now. I think that's a lot about how intrusive thoughts work. When we feel like we can't leave our intrusive thoughts alone, right? When we feel like, well, I have to know the answer to this, because what if I am a bad person? Or what if I really am causing harm to somebody? Or what if something really is going wrong? I think that we have this idea that I have to draw attention to it or else. But if we're capable of not solving that equation, we're also capable of not playing with our intrusive thoughts. And so I just really like that analogy as a takeaway. And so, yeah, I would just love to hear some of the things that you guys use as reminders to not play with your intrusive thoughts or not ruminate with your intrusive thoughts, because that usually tends to make them much, much stronger. And then in the meantime, any questions are welcome, as long as they're appropriate and supportive of your peers that are joining. So I will answer those from my clinical knowledge and personal experience. So please start throwing those in the chat as well. I know that everybody on these community conversations has a different style with it. So hopefully this is one that we can all have fun with. Hi, Chad. Thanks for joining. The whole family's watching in Florida. I love that. I was just in Florida. I got back late last night. I was at the airport all day. My husband's family worked with United, so we get to fly standby, and the ticket that I got did not work. My loving husband did not book it correctly, and so yeah, it was a brutal day for me. And but I loved Florida. Unfortunately, it was really bad weather all weekend, so didn't get a whole lot of sunshine. Daughter's been asking more about asked to start watching. I love that you guys are watching that together as a family. I want this to be educational for everyone. And I think, depending on age, you can really talk about the OCD subtypes in as collaborative as a way as you can. And, with the different types of taboo intrusive thoughts, just keeping age appropriate examples in there. I think that's something else that's really important to note, is that regardless of the age, adolescents and teens and kiddos can also experience sexual and harm intrusive thoughts. The content of them just might look a little different. And so they might be able to better understand with some of those other examples. Also on the peaceofmind.com, peace of mind, PEACE of mind.com, there's a really incredible section for families. I might be biased because I helped type up some of that section, but I'm not even really concerned with the wording. But if you scroll down to the bottom of that for families section for caregivers and loved ones, there's incredible video content, how to explain how to explain OCD to a loved one, reassurance seeking versus information seeking, all of these really great pieces of content. You should definitely check out the website. Wiley, sometimes I feel it's hard to work on my mental health when the world seems to be growing more insane. Yeah, no, I hear you. And I think that it's important to note that if we get distracted by anything, I love that we have the link there. Thank you so much. If we get distracted by the things of this world, it's so easy to put off our own mental health, right? I know for me, a big thing that I catch myself doing nowadays, because my OCD is not severe like it used to be, and I don't have intrusive thoughts that disrupt my day daily. I still have intrusive thoughts. They just don't really grasp my attention like they used to. But I find that I tend to cling on to perfectionism more now. And so if life's really busy and I'm feeling overwhelmed, I can catch myself grasping onto trying to do things more perfectly, really ruminating about my mistakes and dwelling about them. And I can just say, this is just a season. This is just a season. When life's not so busy, then I'll work on this. And that's not what I would tell my patients to do. I would tell my patients to make time to prioritize mental health and mental well-being. And I know that's really hard for all of us. And it's something that I'm still working on daily as well. But I always, kind of like to think of this idea of, would I tell a friend to put their mental health on hold? Or would I tell my friend the harsh things that I tell myself? And if the answer is no, then I probably need to work on how I communicate with myself and prioritize some of these things too. Maya said, I can't stay long. Wanted to say I'm filling out a study abroad application and writing about the message, cry while washing the dishes, as a valuable life lesson I've learned. Oh, that's really cool. Yeah. Cry while washing the dishes. Does anyone else know what Maya is talking about here? I feel like that's something that Ethan has probably referenced. But I think, to me, Maya, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I take that as you can feel these anxious thoughts, or you can recognize that I have these anxious thoughts or these things that are really bothering me, and I can still engage in life, right? So we often think that, when I'm triggered, everything else needs to be put on hold. But actually, good ERP, good exposure with response prevention is, I'm noticing that I'm triggered now, and I still have to go pick up my kid from school, and I still have to answer my emails. And that's a big part of inhibitory learning, a big part of teaching your brain that it can tolerate this anxiety, that we can still live a valued and fulfilled life. Some of you might have at some point struggled with false memory OCD. And this is where you have a specific intrusive thought or something happened, and you replay that in your head to determine how it happened exactly, and your mind just fills all these extra details to it. So you might have convinced yourself, I did this horrible, terrible thing that was completely against my values, and you just replay it and you replay it. And then as we continue to replay it, what happens is we usually add extra details, right? We make the story more vast, more enriched with all of these really scary thoughts, and it just scares us more. And so sometimes we have to focus on this radical acceptance piece of, I'm not actually getting any closer to the truth by trying to solve this answer, by trying to figure out exactly what happened 10 years ago whenever this triggering situation took place. I'm actually getting further from that answer. I'm getting less clarity because, like I said, when we replay thoughts over and over, we tend to add extra details, and we tend to get even more muddied waters. And so one of my favorite quotes of all time is, we get clarity when we stop trying to get clarity. That means when we stop trying to compulse and figure out with certainty about something, we're actually able to look back one day and say, oh, that really was all my OCD. And that can take a while, right? But the second you start playing with those intrusive thoughts, the longer we're drawing out the triggers. So I think that's really important to just kind of keep in mind. Let's see. Yes, I'm glad that was on, Maya, with what you were saying. I figured that was the right track, but I wasn't 100% sure. And Beth, I'm assuming that came from you. That's really cool. Glad that you guys are both here. Okay, so thinking about some of the, maybe if your family members, I know we have some family members watching, if they have specific questions about OCD, about what it looks like, or about what goes on in treatment, please put those. I'd love to answer questions for family members or loved ones. If those questions are coming up, please put them in the chat. Abdullah, thank you for your question. Can you guide us how to use core fears and make values-based exposure hierarchies for ACT and ERP? I love core fears work. It's very important. And so when you are thinking about doing an exposure, often we don't recognize what the core fear is. And I always like to say it's kind of like playing a game of whack-a-mole. If we are doing an exposure, but we're not actually leaning into the core fear. And so that might look like, for contamination OCD, this desk that I'm sitting at might feel contaminated. But I am doing this exposure of touching it, and then I'm cross-contaminating, but then I'm not really leaning into the core fear of, well, what's my fear of something happening, right? So like me saying I'm cross-contaminating, but it's okay that I touched this desk because I know someone cleaned it yesterday, so I know it's not that dirty. Well, that would be self-reassurance. That's not actually leaning in to the core fear. And if you don't know what your core fear is, something that can be really helpful is asking yourself, and it's not something to do all the time, because then I think we can catastrophize and start to ritualize, but asking yourself, what are you afraid would happen? So maybe if I touch this desk and cross-contaminate, I'm afraid my other things will get contaminated. Okay, well then what? Well, then I'm afraid that I'll contaminate one of my loved ones. Well, then what? Okay, well, I'm afraid that they'll get sick or get really, really ill, and it will be my fault. Okay, and then what? I'm afraid that something bad will happen to them, like they'll die, and I won't be able to cope because I'll be alone and I'll feel guilty for the rest of my life. Ding, ding, ding. That's an example of a core fear, right? That I won't be able to cope is a really common core fear amongst different subtypes of OCD. And that's something important. If you're trying to decide if this is an actual core fear of yours or not, it should carry across other subtypes. So if you are struggling with more than one subtype of OCD, your core fear should really still kind of carry across, right? So like, let's say I have contamination and harm OCD. Both of those, like me fearing that I'm going to cause harm to my family and won't be able to cope, that's still true for harm OCD and still true for contamination OCD. So when we're doing this exposure of me touching the desk and cross-contaminating, me leaning into my core fear is saying, I'm surrendering from trying to control whether or not something will happen to my family, and I'm leaning into uncertainty there. And it's very important that you're hearing me say I'm leaning into uncertainty. I am not asking someone to accept their worst case scenario core fear as true. That would be really tough for anyone to do, right? So we're not asking patients to go to this place of, well, you have to accept that all your loved ones are going to die and that it would be your fault. No one would ever want to come back to therapy if that were the case. We're asking you to accept and to grow in your ability to sit in some more uncertainty. So maybe that would look like, I'm going to take the risk that this contamination stuff might be part of my OCD. I'm going to take the risk that maybe I can live with some of this cross-contamination. Let's see, right? It's going to that middle ground place of, I'm not fully self-reassuring that, well, the desk was in fact wiped down and so everything's safe. I'm not fully going to the worst case scenario of, I have to accept that something bad will happen to my family and it'll be all my fault and I won't be able to cope. But we're somewhere in the middle of that. We're leaning into this idea that I can handle some uncertainty. And I like to point out too, everyone handles uncertainty. Even if you have OCD, even if your OCD is severe, there is something you handle uncertainty well with. So maybe you don't have any compulsions with driving, and maybe you're on the way to the store, and on the way to the store, you're thinking about, well, I need to get milk, I need to get eggs. You're not thinking of this 1% chance of getting in a car accident, never making it. Is your life insurance set up for your kids? Nobody would want to think that way, right? But when it comes to your OCD, whatever your OCD latches onto, that's the route that we often take. We take that 1% and we tell ourselves we can't tolerate not knowing without 100% certainty that everything will be okay. And the reason OCD keeps spinning is because we can't have certainty in life, and we don't in other areas. And there is an area you live healthily with uncertainty. And if your mind is going, no, I don't, I know every area is really triggering for me, I'm going to challenge you to try to find one, because I think it's really important to teach yourself that your brain can tolerate that, because that builds motivation for doing harder exposures, right? Even if it's playing a board game with a family member and you can tolerate not knowing if you're going to win or not, that's an example of you handling uncertainty well. So find that thing. And what we need to do with the OCD that's kind of gotten off the healthy train tracks of uncertainty is get it back on, just like it does with other areas of your life where you navigate uncertainty well. So going back to core fears, so you lean in with your core fear and you let go of this idea of I have to control, or I have to make sure that all my family is safe. And instead, I'm going to treat this like OCD, because so far I've treated it like this is a true signal emergency. And sometimes I like to ask patients, and where has that gotten us? Right? Because you're coming to me because you've already treated all of those intrusive thought signals like emergencies. And that's only kept you spinning. And so now we're coming to treatment because we know that hasn't been working. And so can we instead treat it more like, yeah, maybe I'll take the risk that this might be my OCD. And I don't love when patients say, this is definitely my OCD. I'm going to do that every time. This is definitely my OCD, because then that becomes self-reassurance. That's why I like to say, take the risk this might be my OCD. I'm not fully buying in that it's my OCD, but I'm also not fully buying in that it's the worst case scenario possible thing is true that would be totally debilitating to accept. We're somewhere in the middle. And so ACT plays a part in this as well, because oftentimes we don't have the motivation to do the hard work. And so the reason I use this family example, right, is maybe someone has this desire to have healthy relationships with their family members or their loved ones, or to build healthy relationships. But for the past year, they've been asking their family members constant reassurance questions for the purpose of keeping their family safe, right? Like, hey, did you wash your hands after you touched that? Because I know I touched it earlier and my hands were dirty. Want to make sure you know that they were dirty so you could wash your hands and stay safe, right? If you're doing all of that, what do you think happens over time with those relationships? If you're constantly seeking reassurance, although you value healthy relationships, well, your relationships start to falter, right? You're not able to have meaningful relationships with them anymore, get to know about your family members' days and really invest in their lives, because you're constantly seeking reassurance, and that hurts the relationships with the family members. And so what we really try to do when we incorporate ACT into ERP is we try to re-highlight those important values, point out how those OCD behaviors are actually doing the opposite of what we're wanting to grow towards in our values, right? It's actually hurting those relationships, even though the intentions of anxiety are good, even though the intentions are to help, it does the opposite. Because and that's a really big reason why ACT helps build that motivation, because we feel like, well, this is in line with my values to clean all these things and to keep my family safe. But then when we really break it down, it's actually hurting all of these areas of life. I always like to use this example of, if someone has checking behaviors and they check locks, stoves, and appliances, well, let's say their front door has a keyhole. It's like an old-fashioned keyhole, and every night before they go to bed and multiple times in the day, they're going to make sure that the door is locked, and they have to put the key in the keyhole and turn it multiple times to make sure that it is in fact locked. And I don't know, we lock our doors once to twice a day, but let's say for the sake of this person's OCD severity, they're checking this keyhole 50 times a day, 50 plus times a day. And over time, their desires are pure, like their values are to keep their family safe, right? To make sure that nothing happens to their loved ones, to make sure that their house is secured. But if they're checking that lock 50 plus times a day and they're wiggling that key in that lock, what starts to happen to the lock? It starts to wear down, right? So their desire to keep family safe is good intentioned, but because they're feeding OCD, the lock is actually wearing down over time. And so that's an example, again, of how we highlight how OCD overpowers our values. And if we truly are doing exposures, even though it feels really scary, and even though sometimes it feels like are you sure we're in line with my values here? Well, our feelings when it comes to OCD or an anxiety disorder aren't always super reliable. And so instead, we do this behavioral work, this ERP, this acceptance and commitment therapy, and we change these behaviors. And I always like to say our feelings follow. Our feelings catch up over time. That anxiety starts to lower. It starts to not always throw this signal that there's a fire in the room when we do an exposure. So I hope that's helpful, Abdullah. Thank you for your question. Beth, I'm sorry to hear about the long COVID. I hope that you are able to engage and socialize. Another really important thing with any mental illness is we know that isolation tends to make symptoms worse. And so if there's ways like joining these community conversations, excellent job, or other ways you can stay involved with other people, I think I can't emphasize enough the importance of that. Let's see here. Hi, Cash. All right. Questions. Nope. This is Callie Werner, not Reverend Katie O'Dunn, although she's a great friend of mine. Okay. Yeah, I work with Liz. That's right. We do the podcast together, Anxiety Society podcast. It's great. You should check it out. Let's see. John asked a question. What if the intrusive thoughts come from violent or gory media that you saw that was traumatizing, and not only are you emotionally disturbed by it, but it replays intrusively over and over? Yeah, it's a good question. I think oftentimes when it comes to intrusive thoughts and OCD, our memories tend to be more vivid and often very, very detailed. And so one thing I will say is when you see that content or when it's replaying in your head, I think we have this urge to have a physical response, like, oh, get out of my head, or no, I don't want that thought. And I would challenge you, John, if that is something you're doing, I'm not sure, but I would challenge you to work on eliminating that physical response, because even when we have a physical response like that, we're still sending a message to the brain that there is something to be nervous about. We're sending a message to the brain that there is in fact danger. And so we kind of have to, when that memory comes back up again, we kind of have to respond like, oh, interesting thought, brain, even though there might be a part of your brain that is screaming, the amygdala is misfiring, that there is danger, but really responding with that physical and just internal response of, interesting thought, brain. And I think the more we try not to think of that thought, I'm pretty sure everyone on this group has heard the pink elephant analogy before, right? If you don't try not to think of a pink elephant, you're going to think of it. So instead, I like to say, I do a lot of sports psych work. And so I like to say, play offense instead of defense. And so defense looks like, man, I really hope I'm going to be able to go to this party without having any intrusive thoughts. Well, if we're playing defense, we're actually way more likely to have a bunch of intrusive thoughts. So playing offense would be, yeah, I am going to go to this party and I'm going to try to enjoy it and I'm going to play offense. And so that would look like, I know intrusive thoughts are going to come up, but I'm going to be ready. I'm going to be ready to do an exposure and then I'm going to get back to the party. So when we play offense, we're more prepared. And the thoughts are less likely to surprise us. So we're actually less likely to give into those physical responses. And so I would just encourage you to keep that in mind. Play offense instead of defense. Go into those moments, or someone said the analogy of crying at the kitchen sink while doing dishes, right? Like, can both exist? Can you have some of those intense emotions coming up, and can you also still be there for your friend? And can you still also participate in that board game? Because the answer is yes, you can. And when we let that focus shift to the action that we're doing, the intrusive thought doesn't overpower, right? So I'm not sure if you were on earlier, John, but I use this analogy of an equation, solving for an equation. We kind of know that equation's there. It can be in the background, but we don't have to solve that complicated math equation. We can just recognize it for what it is. When we start solving it, there's no way we're going to be present with that board game. There's no way we're going to be present with our friends and our loved ones, and we're going to get overwhelmed by solving that equation. So just let it be there. Recognize the equation. Another thing that I think when intrusive thoughts get really scary or really intense, or they feel really heavy, as hard as it may be, depending on the content that you watched, adding humor can make the exposure a little easier. So there's a lot of ways we can add humor to harm intrusive thoughts and sexual intrusive thoughts. But one of my favorite ways to do it is rhyming. And so if there's like a really nasty word that comes up, or a really triggering word, could you find another word that rhymes with it? With little kids, I often will use funny accents when we say one of those triggering words. There's actually an app that changes your voice, and we might put a triggering word in the voice changing app, and we might just listen to it a few times, right? To engage in this reminder that I can handle this, and maybe I can laugh a little too, instead of treating it like the rest of my body has been treating it, of danger, danger, danger. Really good insights there, John. I hope that was helpful. Beth said, I was afraid my dad would fall and hit his head, so I did compulsions to keep him safe. One time I didn't, and my brother called and told me my dad fell and hit his head. And I think your OCD said something, but I'm not seeing the end of that. But all that to say, Beth, you make a good point, right? Like I said earlier, there isn't ever 100% certainty that everything will always be okay. Just like people with health anxiety. Sorry for those that have joined with health anxiety. I do have a lot of congestion right now. So if that's triggering, roll and lean into it. But just like individuals with health anxiety or emetophobia, biggest fear ever is to get sick and throw up. But sometimes we get sick and sometimes we throw up. Now, there's other harm, OCD, sexual intrusive, like things like that aren't like within your values. And I'm not saying we should accept that those things are also things that we have to accept are going to happen. But no, there's like everyday life things that are really hard to cope with. And I think that the reality is, when those happen, it's not that we need to try everything to prevent them from happening, right? Because if someone's loved one was going to get ill, or if someone was going to die, and I know grief is such a complicated, tough thing that would take a whole other session to talk about, of course we would have rather that not happen, but the work comes afterwards. So the work comes with, I'm not going to attach OCD meaning to my dad hitting his head, right? I'm not going to say, well, my homework is to recognize that these things happen and I have to lean into some uncertainty here. And if I'm attaching it's because I did X, Y, Z, well, that's compulsions. Exposures would be, I don't know exactly what caused it, and it is unfortunate, and I'm going to be here for my dad, but I'm going to lean into not knowing exactly why this happened, because regardless, we don't know exactly why it happened, right? You could have done all these compulsions, not done all these compulsions, and the same still could have happened. But the exposure when it comes to tragic events and things happening usually comes after the fact of not attaching extra meaning. Beth, thanks for your vulnerability there. I love that you guys all communicate, Wiley, Cash, everybody's so present on here, and it makes me smile. Let's see, autoimmune conditions and neurodivergence associated with OCD. Oliveri, I think I'm hoping I'm saying your name correctly. I can't speak too much to this. A lot of individuals with autoimmune conditions are also working with a medical provider, I would say. So like PANS and PANDAS, if it's caught early, a medical provider can prescribe antibiotics, a specific type of antibiotic to help treat that. If it's prescribed, I think, after the 3-month window, then we're still using ERP to target this. I also think everybody has different opinions on like the appropriate medical provider fit for them. And there's a lot of controversy about how to treat certain things when it comes to more in-depth autoimmune conditions, like Lyme disease or things like that. I think my 2 cents when those complicated, complex things come up is we just can't go too far one way or too far the other way. And so I think any provider or doctor you can continue to get testing if you want to continue to get testing, right? And sometimes we recognize that going too far down that path can be very expensive and painful because we might not get the exact answer that we're looking for. So I know there's a plethora of autoimmune diseases, and I'll just say I'm not a medical provider, but can speak to the PANS PANDAS piece. But there's some great resources out there, and you want to be able to trust your doctor like you trust your therapist. And so what I mean by that is when it comes to autoimmune conditions, because oftentimes I'm speaking more to health anxiety here now, Oliveri, which is probably not the point you're seeking information for, but from a health anxiety perspective, just like your therapist would challenge you and have you lean into, could this be your anxiety, right? Like, do I need to go to that additional appointment? I think a good medical provider should be working with your therapist to help do that too, instead of continuing tests if this truly would be something more related to health anxiety. And then the neurodegenerative piece as well. I wish I could speak more to that. I know that oftentimes the symptoms of OCD can progress as someone is getting older, and there can be some memory lapses and other things going on that can make it really hard for someone to engage in ERP effectively. And so my preference is for them to get a full neuropsych eval for someone that is able to work in that population. And that's usually someone that's trained very specifically for full neuropsychological assessments. And that neuropsych eval is pages long and very helpful, very in-depth, and really good for your clinical provider to see, just to know if there's more going on than just the OCD in the brain that might be more challenging to respond to the ERP alone. So I wish I could go into more in depth about those things, but I'm not an expert in that area. Very much more so able to speak to the health anxiety lens of that. Let's see. Oh, I think we've got the rest of Beth's message, but Beth, I hope that I was able to answer that. I think, at the end of the day, recognizing that, of course, my OCD is going to attach meaning to this, right? Like knowing that our vulnerabilities are, did I cause harm? If that's harm OCD, or is someone sick? Like, I would kind of work on that response of, oh yeah, of course my OCD is coming up here. That's a huge vulnerability for me. That's a huge stressor for me. Trying to have that kind of response instead of the, oh no type of response, which just sends more signals and compulsions and all of these triggers to the brain. Let's see. John said, diagnosed with numerous different diagnoses. Yeah, that's hard. And I think the other thing I'll say too, John, is most individuals with OCD usually have a comorbid diagnosis of another disorder. So you're not alone in that, whether it's another anxiety-related disorder or something more complex. But effective treatment is out there and it's helpful, and you're not alone in that. And I think sharing like you're doing is a really powerful thing to help reduce stigma and help other people see that they're not alone in it. Not to trigger, but sometimes the things you're afraid of are going to happen. Yeah, that's kind of what we were talking about, right, Beth? So it is not something that you caused. Oh, music to my ears. I feel like you probably said that after or before I even said it. So kind of answering your own questions there, but love what you said there. I love the support, the building up that you guys are doing for each other. Let's see, other questions. Can impending retirement make OCD get as bad as it was in the beginning? Great question, Lisa. So I always just like to echo, I work in a residential facility for severe OCD and at OCD Institute of Texas, our goal when someone is engaging in residential treatment is to, whether they're retired, whether they are wanting to retire, whether they have a lot of stress at the workplace, but have been doing all of these compulsions, when they start to get better, would be setting them up to fail if we are going to discharge them, meaning have them step down from treatment to go back to zero structure. And so I think the important piece with that is, one, making sure that you have enough structure that you're looking forward to and excited to engage in, even if you've got some anxiety and some nervousness. But also, Lisa, if you have impending retirement coming up, like you're anticipating it, I'd imagine there's stressors that come with that, like new ideas about like, how am I going to pay these bills, or just a lot of change that you have to adapt to. And we know that stress tends to exacerbate symptoms of anxiety. And so I would just keep in mind that sometimes it's helpful to say, yeah, that's where that's coming from. I'm more stressed out here, and I know that I need to put on my ERP hat in this area, because any big life changes or transitions can increase symptoms of stress, which in turn, if the OCD is something you're working on, can increase OCD symptoms. So until it isn't. And I think that's important to note too, as you do this ERP work, guys, as for those that hopped on at the very beginning, for me, it used to be when I would be stressed out or a life change was coming up, that I would be giving in to my OCD. And now when stressors come up, I just notice that I dwell on mistakes a little bit longer. I get stuck with more perfectionistic tendencies. Not to say that perfectionism is easier by any means, no, but perfectionistic tendencies are different from a diagnosis of OCPD, right? And so, but to me, even though when I get hard on myself of, oh, why am I dwelling on this mistake? Okay, well, that's growth. That's a step in the right direction. That's further along than I was the first time. So I think that's really important to keep in mind and note. Okay, Anxiety Society podcast. I'm so glad you asked. So I will put the link in the chat, and this is on all, I don't know if I can, but it's on all streaming services. And so wherever you get your podcast, you can find it. But if you go to anxietysocietypodcast.com, you can listen directly from that website. So anxietysocietypodcast.com. It's on Spotify, Apple, all of the good things. And some really great content, although I might be a little bit biased. So thanks for asking. Let's see here what else we have. Cash, you're going to Japan on Saturday? Oh my goodness. I hear it's a really cool place, but I know that probably means there's a lot of exposures coming your way. So one thing that I would say is, as a reminder, is just take it 1 hour at a time. Sometimes we think about all of the things we're going to do in the next 5-10 days, and that can feel debilitating. versus if we just take it at the moment that we're in, it can be a little bit easier to fight that specific moment and do the work that we need to do. Yeah, I think that can feel more empowering and you'll get further along in the exposure work. Is OCD inherited or just a mutation of genes? Good question. We know and we don't know. So we know that there's a genetic component tied to OCD, but we don't know necessarily how much of it is a genetic component. And so, or if that means that maybe family members can just have symptoms of anxiety, or, you know, I think that there truly is a biopsychosocial piece that fits in. Like it's a combination of things, in my opinion, that just through my observation and work in the field, there's a biological component, there's an environmental component, and there is other things going on in life and stressors that make up some of the OCD symptoms. And oftentimes people will say, well, does trauma cause OCD? And I would say, or like, does this disaster cause OCD? And the way I usually answer that is, well, we know that there's a genetic predisposition, but something like a traumatic event can set off the OCD and make it hard to turn it back down, if that makes sense. Spence sharing your recent exposure. I went to pump gas while the sun was out. Before I always had to pump gas in the dark. Way to go. That's awesome. I hope you feel empowered after doing that instead of super triggered. I think sometimes we can do those really tough exposures and we forget that they're supposed to be bittersweet, not just bitter. So what I mean by that, you know, if I had a patient that had to go do a public exposure, maybe they have social anxiety and their goal was to go order at the counter boba tea. Well, they were anxious because they had to order the boba tea, but they got a treat at the end of it. They were able to enjoy their boba. So keeping in mind areas where you can do that, like that reward that comes with it, right? Maybe you don't always feel the reward. Maybe it's, well, I need to spend time with my family, but being with my family is triggering because of these obsessions that I have. But maybe it was sweet that this is the first time you've had a conversation with a family member in a while, right? Even if it doesn't feel that way yet, that behavior change is what we should be identifying as success. And I think often we get it wrong, guys. I think we often measure wins based off of the feelings that we're having. Well, remember, our feelings aren't always super reliable when we're struggling with an anxiety disorder, right? And so we really, especially when you're first doing exposures, should be basing our wins off of the behavior change that we're engaging in. So that being said, someone might tell me, well, I didn't have a good week of exposures because I had all these intrusive thoughts. My response to that is, well, that's not an indicator of success because we can't control our intrusive thoughts. We all have intrusive thoughts, right? So that's not the way to measure success. Did you do your exposures? And if they say, well, yeah, I did the exposures, but I had intrusive thoughts. Okay, well, that's a good behavior change. That's something we should be celebrating as a win. Even though you had those intrusive thoughts, you still did the exposures. And so keeping in mind that behavior change is that first step in helping those feelings to feel less intense. Which part of the brain is usually affected by OCD? Yeah, another good question. And I'm not super confident in this area, but I know the amygdala is where the misfiring happens. But I would say, Oliveri, that a lot of these pieces of the brain play in part together. So if someone wants to do the research and put it in the chat while I'm chatting, feel free to do that. But I think a lot of these, have an impact. So the pituitary gland definitely has an impact. There's a really great PowerPoint slide that I won't be able to pull up in time that shows the different parts of the brain and how one impacts the other. And so there's about 4 or 5 parts of the brain that are impacted when OCD is at play. There's also a lot of different chemicals or pieces that are naturally produced in the brain, right? Like serotonin. Oftentimes, anxiety disorders are indicative of lower serotonin levels. Cortisol plays a big part. Dopamine plays a big part, right? So there's all these components that a psychiatrist would probably be able to speak to a little bit better than I am right now, but hopefully that's somewhat helpful. And yeah, a really important, good question. Let's see. Yeah, it's really hard. I think something that I like to say, John just shared that he's an empath, and it's really hard to see harm coming to others. But it's a normal human response to witness others being harmed or dealing with really tough things. And I think that's absolutely true. I also think that although we would never wish OCD on anybody, because of what you've gone through, you truly have this level of empathy that can be unmatched, because you can see what it's like to suffer in these very unique ways. But also what I think is so important is to grow and not settle for that suffering, right? To be able to get to a place where you have more freedom from the OCD, and then can help others on that path, on that journey, and you really are able to resonate or understand what that pain is like, but give them a message of hope. So wherever you're at on your journey, knowing that all of this resilience that you're working through, you've built empathy that can be unmatched, unless someone else has gone through OCD. And I think if we're looking for any gift, like I said, although we wouldn't wish OCD on anybody, that's the silver lining in it all, is that empathy can do wonders for your future and for the future of others. Okay. Yeah. Chad said life changes and stressors have definitely ramped up OCD and anxiety. Absolutely. Yeah. Those big life stressors tend to be what trigger or set off the OCD. A big part of my own journey, when I finally got diagnosed, struggled with OCD 3 onward, was that I'm a big distance runner, and my OCD always was exacerbated around the time of a race. I put a lot of pressure on myself for races that paid for my college. And so when I was in college training, trying to qualify for nationals, my OCD symptoms would just spike, and it would be like clockwork at the week before every race until the OCD got more and more severe and I couldn't turn it off anymore. And then I finally kind of stayed at this steady level of severity and finally was pointed to the right direction to get appropriate help. So I think that we all have these moments in life where stressors come into play, and we recognize, oh, I've got urges to do more compulsions. And when you are able to recognize where it's coming from, not that that's required or something that you definitely need to do every time, but it's helpful to call it out of, oh yeah, of course I'm having intrusive thoughts right now. I'm under a lot of stress. So that's just a good reminder that, and I shouldn't be giving OCD that extra power. Thank you, guys. Let's see. Spence put a great comment in the chat about the brain. So feel free to read through that. Spence, thanks for your research. Chad's daughter, who's 10, wanted to ask, what are some things people can do for OCD and anxiety during school? That's a great question. Chad's daughter, big shout out. In a school setting, OCD can appear a lot of different ways, right? So someone might fear when they're taking an exam, they might have cheated on the exam. And so they might go tell on themselves, or they might do everything they can to possibly to ensure that they are in fact not cheating. And that can cause a lot of stress, and it can actually feed the OCD more. And so when it comes to doing exposures, I would say the first thing is it's so helpful to have a therapist to keep you accountable, right? It's really hard to navigate OCD all on your own. But exposures in a school setting might look like allowing those intrusive thoughts to come up and really naming that as part of the OCD bully, right? That sometimes I like to give OCD bullies a name. And so I will ask kids, what's your least favorite color and your least favorite food? And so maybe their OCD bully's name is purple carrots. And so when the bully tries to throw these intrusive thoughts of you cheated and you need to tell on yourself, when really that is an OCD intrusive thought, oh, that's just my purple carrots talking, and I've got to get back to what I'm doing here. We might also have school exposures of compulsions or desires to reread or rewrite. And so the exposure would be, I'm going to turn this in imperfectly, or I'm going to turn this in, or I'm going to answer this question without knowing 100% certain what that article said. I'm not going to go back and reread it again. There might be contamination exposures in the school setting someone's working on. There might be exposures leading into not over apologizing. I think the opportunities are limitless, and really OCD can appear in every subtype in a school setting or out of a school setting. And so there's lots of great exposures one can do. Often if I'm ever, I work in a clinic with a lot of other OCD providers, and so we're always able to brainstorm with each other on exposures to do in a clinical setting. And we have this long list of things we can do for every subtype. But there's this book called The Great Book of Exposures that has some really creative, good ideas on there as well. So Chad's daughter, I hope that was helpful for you. Thank you for submitting that question. Let's see. We've got about 7 minutes left. Yeah, Zohar said that their OCD started when they were 14 years old. But why didn't it start before 14? That's a great question. And really, OCD can onset at any time. We tend to see it onset more during those transition pubescent stages, like 18 to 21 would be one of the more common times. But some, like I said, my OCD symptoms appeared when I was 3 or 4. Some people's OCD symptoms don't appear until much later in life. And so we don't have all the research as to why exactly when that started. Oftentimes we notice the symptoms during a big life change or transition, or like a stressful situation. And so for you, Zohar, I think it just kind of, if you remember that time when you were 14, maybe life was kind of stressful at that point. But all that to say, regardless of the age, we know treatment still works. And so leaning in and working through evidence-based treatment can give life back. Okay. Yeah. Cash started at 5. So yeah, lots of different times. Yeah, autism. Symptoms of autism, that neurodivergence, that can also appear like OCD, or they can be existent together. Oftentimes with autism, we can see these repetitive behaviors that can appear ritualistic, but they actually can be more self-soothing, like rocking back and forth or tapping on a table. And those behaviors are a little bit different from compulsions, right? Someone does compulsions to prevent something bad from happening, or to prevent from feeling really anxious, whereas the repetitive behaviors from autism are more like self-soothing types of behaviors. And so, like I said, one can experience both of those, though. They can have autism and OCD and be engaging in certain behaviors for both reasons. Let's see here. I am so excited everyone's in on Cash's Japan trip. So we just need to do ERP. Treat OCD, there isn't other treatments better than ERP. Great question. As of now, the primary research shows that ERP is still the most up-to-date evidence-based treatment. That being said, there are other treatment modalities that can go hand in hand with treating OCD, and on a case-by-case basis. There's more research coming out about IOCDF. Acceptance and commitment therapy is a really great treatment, and combined with ERP to help one center around their values and to build motivation for treatment. So that's ACT. But yeah, ERP is still considered the gold standard of treatment. It has the most evidence-based research backing it. And so that is what we will continue to do at our clinic until research says otherwise. It's a great question. Let's see here. We've got time for a few more, and I'll try to get to these. Let's see, there's also 4 different neural circuits. Okay, more about the brain. I love it, Amy. Thank you. And how was I able to focus in racing? Yeah, I think it was really tough. I would say it was most tough before the gun went off. That means like before the gun went off, before the race started. When the race started, I had this athletic ability to tune in. And I think with all that adrenaline rush, the OCD symptoms would kind of pause in the midst of the 10, 20-minute race that I was running, but they would pick right back up after I crossed the finish line. And I would say when it got more severe, it was definitely impacting my ability to race. And so people often have this misconception that OCD helps their sport performance, and it doesn't. I look back at those times where I had really great races and I was struggling with OCD for years and years. And although, I was given the ability to achieve some really great things, I always like to reflect on I'd probably be even better if I wasn't spending all that extra energy doing all of those extra compulsions before the race. So yeah, I would say majority of my compulsions were before the race, a little bit after, but as that pressure would build of, I don't know how this race is going to go, my brain would say, well, do these compulsions, because that gives you that sense of control, right? Those superstitious behaviors a lot of athletes engage in would give me a sense of control, but it didn't. It just made my symptoms worse, my anxiety higher, until I couldn't hide it anymore. So answer being, it was tough, tough to focus on that. Okay. Anubis, I'm having a hard time living with people. I live alone and I have OCD and I'm always cleaning and very organized, but having a hard time being around other people and even family. I still push myself to socialize. Amazing. Yeah. I think that, the challenge is when you are struggling or living alone, not having a place where you have that extra accountability, it's way easier to avoid. I always say, if a patient tells me, well, yeah, I can just not do that compulsion, my response is, but if that compulsion is on a silver platter and you're struggling and your insight isn't there because you're triggered, are you sure you're not going to reach for that compulsion, especially if you're early on in treatment? And so, Anubis, something I would say, I don't know where you're at on your OCD journey, and I'm not giving clinical advice, but even in residential settings, oftentimes, because patients have the extra support, we are working with them to start off having a roommate, because it's much harder for them to build up to having a roommate if they don't start off with one when they're in residential treatment. And so I don't know if there's ways that accountability can come into play where you have others in your corner of, yeah, I know I'm going to meet with these friends on these days, but really I think a therapist should be the most beneficial of helping you in those moments do those exposures during the treatment time that you're blocked to see them. So, my favorite thing is to do exposures with my patients. So if a patient struggles to have anybody in their car or in their house, we're working on actively doing exposures where they're maybe bringing their dog into their room or slowly cross-contaminating. And we're doing it together so that they don't feel alone and isolated in that. And when they're feeling that intense panic, we can work on regulating over time and building that confidence. So any ways you can set up accountability, I would say OCD is way too challenging of a mental illness to treat on your own. But having someone that's really going to challenge you, I think often our goal is to have a therapist that makes us feel comfortable, but our goal should be to have a therapist that makes us push, right? That gives us the life that we know that we deserve. And so don't settle for less than that if that's something that you're working on. Spence said, do the endorphins help? Do the endorphins from the runner's high help? Runner's highs are a thing. I would say any exercise helps people feel like they're in a better mood overall. I just think that when it comes to coping, we can't just have one coping skill. So, another big part of my journey was when I was triggered, I would just go run a mile, no matter what. When I could, I would drop it. If I was at lunch, I would drop my bags and I would go run a mile really fast because I was triggered. And I relied solely on that to help me regulate. And that was not healthy. And so I think anything that feels urgent or like you need to do it is probably more in line with a compulsion. In order to have freedom, we need to lean more into that middle ground and have multiple coping strategies to utilize. So this was awesome, you guys. Thank you so much for all of the chat. So much support and participation. I had a blast with you all. Just a couple of closing announcements. The IOCDF is a donor-supported nonprofit organization, so please consider making a donation at iocdf.org/donate. And the IOCDF 30th annual conference will be held between July 11th and the 13th in Chicago. So if you are going, please say hello. I will be there. Many others on these live streams will be there. And so love to have you guys join us and give your support. And let's see, EOI Giving. Join us to help improve the lives of those affected by OCD and related disorders. So your support will help shorten the time it takes for those suffering to get support that desperately need it. And your contribution fuels vital resources, education, and research, while fostering a community united in the fight against obsessive compulsive disorder and related disorders like body dysmorphia and hoarding. Help us reach our goal of 300,000 before 12/31. And you can go to the URL, like I said earlier. This one's a little different, iocdf.org/give. So thank you all for joining. So great to see so many familiar names pop up. Ethan did not die. He'll be back next time. Have a good one.